Nobody saw it coming. The small block didn't just lose, it was killed. Chevrolet's most iconic engine wasn't beaten by performance. It wasn't beaten by reliability. It was dismantled by politics, regulations, and corporate betrayal. And now, the fallout threatens every driver in America. Who pulled the trigger on the small block? Why are rivals celebrating its demise? And what happens when an entire nation loses its mechanical identity? The engine that changed everything. It was 1955, and Chevrolet was on the edge of irrelevance. Ford had already launched its modern V8. Chrysler had unleashed the mighty firepower Hemi, and buyers were leaving behind Chevrolet's outdated straight-six engines. Against this backdrop, the company took a gamble that would reshape automotive history. Instead of following the bigger is better mantra, Chevrolet bet on something radical, a compact, lightweight V8 that would give ordinary Americans access to power previously reserved for luxury cars. The Chevrolet 265 cubic-inch V8 was not the largest, not the most powerful, and certainly not the most intimidating motor on the market, but it was clever. With only about 4.3 liters of displacement and weighing roughly 535 pounds, it was nearly 100 pounds lighter than many competitors. This mattered more than raw horsepower because it changed the driving experience. Lighter engines meant better handling, quicker response, and improved efficiency, ideas that sounded futuristic at the time. What made this engine revolutionary was not only its size, but its philosophy. By placing the camshaft inside the block, using hydraulic lifters and pushrods, and simplifying the casting of block and heads, Chevrolet engineers cut complexity while preserving durability. It was affordable to produce, easy to maintain, and, most importantly, it gave younger buyers and families a taste of performance without a luxury car price tag. For the first time, real speed and excitement were within reach of middle-class Americans. The 265 was more than a piece of machinery. It was a statement of intent. Chevrolet showed that it could outthink the giants of Detroit by focusing on balance, efficiency, and accessibility rather than brute size. This approach would ignite the golden age of American performance cars and plant the seed for the most legendary engine family the country had ever seen. But this was only the opening act. Once the small block proved itself in showrooms and on racetracks, it quickly became something larger than an engine. It became part of America's cultural identity. The golden age of the small block. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the Chevrolet small block had spread everywhere. It powered the humble Bel Air, it roared inside the Corvette, and it even made its way into pickup trucks. No matter where you looked, the heartbeat of America seemed to be driven by the rumble of that V8. What had started as a clever engineering experiment had transformed into a cultural phenomenon. For many teenagers, the small block was the ticket to freedom. With a few garage tools, a backyard mechanic could swap a carburetor, tune the ignition, or bolt on performance parts and feel the difference instantly. The accessibility of the small block meant it was not just a machine for professionals or the wealthy. It belonged to the people. The sound of its exhaust note became a kind of mechanical music, a language understood across city streets, drag strips, and open highways. Racing only amplified this identity. Stock car racing, drag strips, and weekend competitions became dominated by Chevrolet's compact powerhouse. It was not simply that the small block won races, it was that it allowed ordinary people to participate in the dream of racing. For the first time, you did not need exotic equipment or deep pockets. You only needed a Chevy, a wrench, and the will to go faster. The small block's golden age was not measured only in horsepower numbers. It was measured in cultural moments. Late-night drives, friends gathering around a car hood, families traveling cross-country with confidence, and young hot rodders carving their first quarter mile. The small block was not just in cars, it was in music, movies, and the national imagination. It represented freedom, possibility, and the thrill of the open road. Yet while Chevrolet basked in glory and brand loyalty soared, competitors were not standing still. Other automakers saw the cultural grip of the small block and plotted their own challenges, determined to take a piece of Chevy's empire. If you think this story matters, hit that like button right now, because the more people see this, the harder it is for them to bury it. And subscribe, because the next twist, you won't want to miss it. Rivals take their shot. Ford entered the race aggressively with its Y-block engines in the mid-1950s, touting technical sophistication and strong performance. Chrysler had already set the high watermark with the firepower Hemi, which stunned enthusiasts with raw power and a unique design. Each competitor believed they had found the formula to dethrone Chevrolet's small block. On paper, many of these engines offered higher displacement or cutting-edge features, and in the right cars, they were formidable. But what Ford and Chrysler could not replicate was Chevrolet's accessibility. Chevy. The brilliance of the small block was not only in how it performed, but in how widely it could be used. From affordable sedans to high-performance Corvettes, Chevrolet slipped the V8 into every segment of its lineup. This ubiquity created a sense that the small block was everywhere, available to everyone. Rivals might win headlines with big numbers, but Chevrolet won hearts with mass adoption. This dominance carried a hidden risk. Because Chevrolet's formula seemed unbeatable, the company grew comfortable. Engineers continued refining the small block, but often relied on the strength of its cultural appeal rather than innovating aggressively for the future. Competitors chipped away with incremental gains, but the bigger danger was not outside competition. It was internal complacency. When you are the king of the hill for too long, you begin to believe the hill will always be yours. The irony was clear. The very success that had cemented Chevrolet's legacy also planted the seeds of overconfidence. While rivals looked for new ways to adapt to changing markets, Chevrolet leaned heavily on tradition. And as history often shows, tradition can be both a strength and a weakness. Soon, external forces would expose just how fragile the foundation of the V8 empire had become. The first cracks in the block, the 1970s brought storms that no engine could easily withstand. Oil crises sent fuel prices soaring, and suddenly, the image of massive, thirsty V8s shifted from aspirational to impractical. Families that once dreamed of horsepower now worried about fuel bills, and the very culture that the small block had helped build began to question its value. At the same time, new emissions regulations emerged, forcing automakers to adapt engines to meet environmental standards. Compression ratios dropped, horsepower ratings declined, and the once mighty small block felt shackled by restrictions. Cars that had been celebrated for raw power suddenly felt sluggish, and buyers noticed. A machine that once symbolized freedom now carried the stigma of inefficiency. Consumer preferences also began to shift. Compact cars from overseas entered the American market, offering lighter frames and better mileage. While Chevrolet tried to modernize the small block, the engine's DNA was rooted in an earlier era. Its design, once revolutionary, now seemed stubbornly tied to the past. The weight advantage that mattered in 1955 was overshadowed by demands for fuel economy and cleaner emissions. The cracks in the block were not catastrophic yet, but they were undeniable. What had once been an unstoppable cultural force was now vulnerable to forces outside Chevrolet's control. The golden age was fading, and the empire built on the roar of the small block would soon face challenges greater than any competitor's engine. And just as Chevrolet wrestled with these mounting pressures, a new generation of challengers prepared to upend the rules of the game entirely. Racing becomes religion. By the mid-1960s, the Chevrolet small block had left the garage and thundered onto the racetrack. It was no longer just an engine for everyday drivers. It was the weapon of choice for those chasing glory. Stock car racing in particular became its spiritual home. On the ovals of Daytona and Talladega, the compact V8 roared with a fury that electrified crowds. Winning races was no longer about prestige alone. It sold cars. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday was more than a slogan. It was the gospel that guided Detroit. Chevrolet understood this better than anyone. They poured resources into tuning the small block for speed and endurance, giving privateers and professional teams alike the tools to dominate. Suddenly, the same engine sitting in a family sedan was claiming victory in races watched by millions. That connection between the track and the driveway created a loyalty that could not be bought with advertising alone. People believed in the small block because they saw it win, and then they drove it home. The sense of belonging was just as important as the trophies. Fans identified with the roar of their brand, and for Chevrolet loyalists, the small block was more than metal and oil. It was identity. Rivalries deepened. Ford enthusiasts clung to their Thunderbirds and Mustangs. Chrysler fans bragged about Hemis. But Chevrolet's small block had something intangible. It was everywhere. It was modifiable, and it gave underdogs a fighting chance. Racing transformed the small block into something like religion. Followed, worshipped, and defended with zeal. But just as religion breeds sects and schisms, competition in racing began to reshape the automotive battlefield. Rivalries spilled beyond the track into showrooms, setting up a cultural arms race that would define the next decade. And Chevrolet's answer to that arms race was about to turn teenagers into rebels and hot rodders into legends. The muscle car revolution. In the late 1960s, America experienced something unprecedented: the birth of the muscle car. It was a cultural explosion, part marketing genius, and at the center of it was the Chevrolet small block. The formula was simple but electrifying: stuff a powerful V8 into a mid-sized, affordable car and unleash it on the masses. Suddenly, performance was not just for the wealthy or the racers. It was for anyone with a decent job and a hunger for speed. The Chevrolet Camaro and the Chevelle SS became the poster children of this movement. Each carried the heartbeat of the small block, delivering affordable thrills that spoke to a restless younger generation. The 1960s were turbulent. Civil rights protests, the Vietnam War, political assassinations, and the muscle car became a kind of rolling escape from that chaos. Behind the wheel, the world felt controllable, the road stretched endlessly, and the future seemed like it could be outrun. The cultural imprint of these cars was staggering. They appeared in songs, on movie screens, and in magazines. Teenagers lined up at dealerships, not to buy luxury, but to buy identity. A car was no longer just transport, it was a badge of defiance, a declaration of individuality. The small block powered that identity with a throaty roar that echoed through suburbs and city streets alike. But with every revolution comes a counterforce. Insurance companies began penalizing performance cars, fuel costs crept higher, and politicians started asking uncomfortable questions about safety and emissions. The golden haze of the muscle car era was intoxicating, but beneath the smoke of burnouts and drag races, trouble was brewing. And just as Chevrolet fought to keep its footing, an unexpected cultural shift would deliver another blow, one that no one in Detroit had anticipated. When culture turned away, cars had always been about identity, but in the late 1970s, that identity shifted. Where once teenagers dreamed of horsepower, many now dreamed of independence through other means. Rising insurance rates made muscle cars unattainable, gas prices made them impractical, and the cultural mood made them outdated. Instead of burnouts, the youth embraced compact practicality, disco culture, and eventually the first whispers of digital technology. The small block, once the center of cultural rebellion, began to feel like a relic of their parents' world. It still had loyalists. Legions of enthusiasts kept tuning, racing, and restoring. But mainstream culture was moving on. Automakers began talking about efficiency, safety, and global competitiveness rather than raw speed. To the average consumer, the small block was no longer the symbol of freedom. It was the symbol of a bygone era. This was a deeper wound than any oil crisis or emissions rule. Regulations could be fought. Fuel prices could eventually stabilize. But culture? When culture turns against you, the ground shifts beneath your feet. For Chevrolet, the small block had been its cultural engine as much as its mechanical one. Losing that cultural resonance meant losing a bond with a generation of buyers. Yet even as the mainstream turned away, a counterculture was forming. Enthusiasts who refused to let the small block die began gathering in garages, racetracks, and car shows. They kept the flame alive, creating a subculture that would, in time, keep the legend relevant even when Detroit had all but given up. And while Chevrolet's glory years were fading, the small block was not finished. History has a way of surprising even the most confident critics, and the next chapter of the small block would prove that legends never truly die. Reinvention in the 80s. By the early 1980s, many declared the small block obsolete. It was heavy, inefficient, and emblematic of a bloated Detroit struggling to keep up with foreign competitors. Yet Chevrolet refused to bury its most iconic creation. Instead, it set out to reinvent it. The third-generation small block arrived in 1986 with a surprising twist: electronic fuel injection. What had once been a carbureted workhorse was now stepping into the computer age. For drivers, this change was transformative. Engines started more reliably, fuel economy improved, and emissions dropped without entirely killing performance. The Corvette, Chevrolet's halo car, showcased just how relevant the small block could remain when paired with modern technology. It was not the raw, unfiltered beast of the 1960s muscle era, but it proved adaptable. Chevrolet's gamble paid off. The small block became known not as a relic, but as a survivor, an engine that could evolve without losing its essence. More importantly, it became the backbone of millions of vehicles, from sedans to trucks. The adaptability of the V8 meant it could still meet consumer demands in a changing market. Yet even as Chevrolet engineered its comeback, the industry itself was shifting once again. Globalization, new trade agreements, and the rise of Asian and European automakers placed unprecedented pressure on Detroit. The small block had survived one cultural death, but now it faced a new kind of battle, staying relevant in a global market where American dominance was no longer guaranteed. And that battle would become most visible not on suburban streets, but in the workhorse trucks that carried the weight of America's economy. Trucks saved the legend. If the small block had been born in the Corvette and immortalized in the Camaro, its survival was secured in the Silverado. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, trucks were no longer just farm tools or worksite machines. They were becoming mainstream family vehicles. Consumers wanted power, durability, and comfort all in one package, and Chevrolet trucks delivered. At the heart of that delivery was the small block V8. Chevrolet leaned into this shift with precision. Advertising campaigns painted trucks as both rugged and aspirational, vehicles that could haul a load of lumber during the day and cruise comfortably to dinner at night. The small block was the soul of that dual identity. Reliable, powerful, and endlessly modifiable, it gave trucks a reputation for toughness that no foreign competitor could replicate at scale. The rise of the truck as America's default vehicle reshaped the industry. By the mid-90s, trucks and SUVs accounted for a growing share of profits, and Chevrolet's small block was pulling double duty as both a cultural symbol and an economic engine. More than ever, the small block was not about drag strips or racetracks. It was about the image of the working American, the backbone of communities, and the promise of dependability. But as the small block found new life in trucks, whispers of change returned. Environmental movements grew louder, climate science gained political weight, and government regulations tightened once more. Trucks had bought Chevrolet time, but that time was not infinite. The company would soon face the reality that the very success of its trucks also painted a target on the back of the small block. And in the 2000s, that culture would shift again, in ways that would both threaten and ultimately transform the future of the small block. The LS revolution. Then came 1997, and with it, a rebirth. Chevrolet unveiled the LS1, the newest generation of its small block V8, and suddenly, the conversation shifted. This was not just an update, it was a revolution. Lighter, more compact, and designed with modern efficiency in mind, the LS platform brought the small block roaring back into relevance. The LS engines were a masterstroke. They powered Corvettes, Camaros, and trucks, but their true genius lay in accessibility, affordable, durable, and capable of enormous power with relatively simple modifications. The LS became the darling of tuners, racers, and backyard mechanics. Swapping an LS into virtually any vehicle became a phenomenon. Imports, classics, even oddball projects, the LS made its way into everything. This was the small block spirit reborn, democratic, powerful, and endlessly adaptable. Enthusiasts around the world embraced it, creating a cult following that expanded far beyond Chevrolet's original intentions. In an ironic twist, the LS helped the small block achieve global influence precisely when Chevrolet itself was struggling to maintain footing against foreign automakers. But the success of the LS was not just mechanical, it was cultural redemption. After decades of doubt, the small block had proven it could still lead innovation while honoring tradition. It had outlived oil crises, survived emissions laws, and adapted to globalization. Yet lurking on the horizon was a challenge unlike any it had ever faced before: the coming wave of electrification. And when that wave arrived, it threatened to do what no rival, no regulation, and no oil crisis had ever managed: to end the reign of the small block altogether. The shock of electrification, the moment the industry had feared, finally arrived. By the mid-2000s, the conversation was no longer about horsepower or torque. It was about sustainability. Tesla, once dismissed as a Silicon Valley curiosity, began delivering vehicles that shattered assumptions about what electric cars could do. Suddenly, the American V8 was no longer just competing with Toyota or Ford. It was competing with silence, instant torque, and the promise of a future without gasoline. For Chevrolet, the threat was existential. The small block V8 had weathered crises before, but electrification was not a temporary storm. It was a fundamental shift. Consumers began to question not only fuel economy, but the very morality of burning fossil fuels. Politicians tightened regulations, investors shifted toward green technologies, and global automakers poured billions into electric platforms. The small block, once a symbol of innovation, now risked becoming an emblem of resistance to progress. Chevrolet scrambled to invest in hybrids and EVs, but the cultural power of the small block made those transitions complicated. Truck buyers still demanded V8s, performance enthusiasts clung to their LS engines, and loyalists saw electrification as a betrayal. Chevrolet faced a brutal balancing act: honor the legacy of the small block while preparing for a future where it might not exist at all. And in that balance, new forces emerged, forces that would redefine not just Chevrolet, but the entire auto industry. Because the fight over engines was no longer just about engineering, it was about politics. Politics enters the garage. The small block was never just metal and oil, it was identity. By the 2000s and 2010s, that identity became weaponized. Politicians framed the V8 as a symbol of freedom, self-reliance, and American grit. Environmentalists countered that it was a relic destroying the planet. The small block had become a cultural battlefield. Policy debates reflected the clash. Federal fuel standards forced automakers to make engines more efficient, while subsidies and incentives encouraged electric adoption. Each move was painted by one side as visionary, and by the other as sabotage. The small block was caught in the crossfire. For Chevrolet, The stakes were brutal. Trucks and SUVs powered by the V8 were its biggest profit centers, yet political winds threatened to undermine the entire model. Meanwhile, rivals like Ford doubled down on experimentation, launching hybrid trucks and preparing for all-electric F-Series models. The message was clear. The future would not wait for nostalgia, but Chevrolet was not alone in this fight. The small block was more than a Chevrolet product. It was a cornerstone of American labor, culture, and industry. And that meant that when its survival was questioned, so too was the future of millions of workers. That workforce would soon make its voice heard, loudly, and with consequences no executive board could ignore. Labor strikes back. In the 1970s, unions had fought to keep jobs in the face of oil shocks and plant closures. By the 2000s and 2010s, they were fighting for survival against automation, outsourcing, and electrification. The small block 5.8 was at the center of this struggle. For many workers, it was more than a paycheck. It was a legacy passed down through generations. Fathers and mothers had built them, sons and daughters wanted to keep building them. As Chevrolet shifted investment toward electric platforms, unions demanded assurances. Would jobs be preserved? Would new factories be unionized? Would the small block survive in parallel with EV production? These questions led to walkouts, strikes, and tense negotiations that drew national headlines. Workers argued that transitioning to electrification could not mean abandoning the people who had kept the company alive through decades of turbulence. The strikes were about wages and benefits, but they were also about identity. The small block had given Detroit its heartbeat, and many feared that abandoning it meant abandoning the workers themselves. For a brief moment, the fight over engines was inseparable from the fight over the soul of American labor. But while unions pushed to protect jobs at home, the global economy was already reshaping the battlefield in ways no strike could stop. The global reckoning. As the 2020s dawned, the small block's fate was tied not just to Detroit, but to the world. China had surged ahead in EV production. Europe was setting aggressive emissions deadlines, and investors demanded that automakers demonstrate climate commitments or face financial punishment. Chevrolet could not cling to the past without risking irrelevance on the global stage. At the same time, consumer expectations shifted. Younger buyers were less attached to the roar of a V8 and more drawn to the instant torque and tech appeal of EVs. Wall Street analysts began framing the small block not as an asset, but as a liability, a symbol of risk in an industry under transformation. Yet the irony was impossible to ignore. Even as EVs dominated headlines, millions of trucks and SUVs with small block engines continued to roll off assembly lines. Rural America still trusted them, enthusiasts still revered them, and developing markets still demanded them. The small block was both dying and thriving at once, a paradox that defined its final era. The story was no longer about whether the small block would end, but about how it would be remembered. Was it a dinosaur that overstayed its welcome, or was it one of the greatest machines ever built? A piece of American ingenuity that adapted, survived, and fought until the very last spark? One thing was certain: the world would never look at Chevrolet the same way again. This isn't the end of the story. It's the opening shot. Hit like, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, because when the next move lands, you'll want to be the first to know.